Don't mistake my silence for blindness. I watched the whole performance, front row, popcorn in hand. You ever act so calm they think you're clueless, only for them to realize you knew everything the entire time? O chosen one, welcome to the great unveiling, where your enemies are now clutching their chests like they just read a plot twist in a thriller you wrote years ago. Here's the fact. Studies have shown that people with high emotional intelligence and spiritual depth can detect betrayal, deception, and insincerity before there's any physical evidence. But what science doesn't explain is the way you knew exactly what they were doing while they were doing it and still played along like you hadn't already seen the ending credits roll. Now they're shocked, not just because you were right, but because you were quietly right the whole time. You didn't need receipts. You didn't need proof. You had divine clearance, full access to the spiritual surveillance footage, and baby, you kept your seatbelt fastened while they crashed their own credibility. So buckle up, because today we're unpacking what happens when a divinely gifted chosen one stares straight into deception, smiles, and lets karma take notes. And by the way, to whoever thought you were slow, bless their hearts. They just didn't know you were giving them enough rope to knit a sweater and hang their lies with a little bow. Let's get into it. Number one, you weren't guessing. You were grieving while watching them perform the betrayal in real time. You weren't guessing. You weren't making assumptions or connecting dots. You were grieving while watching the betrayal unfold in real time. That's the part they'll never understand. They think you only recently found out, but the truth is, you've known for a long time. And knowing didn't make it easier, it made it heavier. Because you had to act normal while everything inside you was falling apart. You had to smile while your spirit was silently screaming, because if you reacted too soon, you would have disrupted what God was setting up behind the scenes. They thought they were playing a clever game behind your back, not realizing you were already 10 steps ahead, quietly watching them self-destruct. You weren't silent because you were stupid. You were silent because you were submitted to God's timing, not your emotions. You already saw the fake conversations, the lies, the betrayal brewing beneath the surface. And instead of exploding, you held it. You swallowed truth like fire. You carried that pain like a secret weight, all while pretending not to notice. You had to grieve the relationship while they were still laughing in your face. You were mourning the death of loyalty while they were still hugging you like nothing had changed. That's what made it so brutal. You weren't shocked by what they did. You were heartbroken because you knew they were going to do it, and you still gave them space to do the right thing, and they didn't. Now they're shocked. Shocked that you knew. Shocked that your discernment was razor sharp. Shocked that you had the strength to stay quiet and let it play out. But what they're really shaken by is the realization that you watched them walk into their own exposure without lifting a finger to stop them. They assumed you were naive. They thought you were easy to fool, but you let the show run its course because you understood something they didn't. God handles betrayal better than revenge ever could. What they see as shocking accuracy is really spiritual clarity. You weren't caught off guard. You were watching a train wreck in slow motion, heartbroken but fully awake. And the entire time you were just waiting for the moment heaven would say, now. Number two, your accuracy wasn't intuition. It was surveillance from a higher realm. They thought you were just highly intuitive, like you had a lucky guess or some kind of gut feeling. But what they didn't realize is that you weren't operating from instinct. You were receiving intelligence from a much higher realm. While they were whispering lies behind closed doors, you were getting full access to the truth through divine downloads. Heaven didn't leave you in the dark. You were being briefed in real time, and the updates were more accurate than anything they could hide. They're blown away by your accuracy because they still don't understand how you knew so much without anyone telling you. They didn't know that your spirit was being fed details straight from the source. You didn't need evidence. You didn't need to spy, snoop, or dig. The truth came to you. It landed in your spirit like a file dropped in a secure inbox, quiet, clean, and undeniable. And because you don't wear your gifts loudly, they assumed you were just guessing. But your discernment isn't just sharp, it's supernatural. While they were plotting, planning, and pretending, you were observing in silence, already aware of the motives behind the masks. You weren't chasing answers. You were sitting with revelation. And when you carry that kind of clarity, it unnerves people. That's why they're shaken. That's why they're confused. It wasn't that you figured it out, it's that you already knew, and they couldn't figure out how. They tried to test you, trick you, mislead you, but the game never really started because you were already holding the final score. You didn't call it out immediately because God didn't give you the green light, but you stored the information, kept calm, and let them reveal themselves in time. That kind of composure isn't normal, and it rattles people when they realize they've been exposed, not by confrontation, but by someone who sat still and watched truth uncover itself. They were playing chess on the ground while you were receiving intel from heaven. They didn't know you were being spiritually surveilled and spiritually informed. What they thought was just vibes or a lucky guess was actually a holy download. That's what scares them now. You weren't intuitive, you were informed. And that kind of knowledge, you can't fake that. Number 3. You didn't speak because you were watching their loyalty expire without renewal. You didn't pull back because you were unsure. You pulled back because you were watching their loyalty die, and there was nothing left to resuscitate. They thought you were distancing yourself for no reason, but the truth is, you had already seen the shift in their spirit. The energy changed, the conversations got hollow, the affection became forced, and you knew without anyone saying a word that the connection had silently expired. You didn't confront them because you weren't trying to save what was already gone. You saw the signs, the subtle shade, the forced smiles, the sudden distance. They didn't realize you weren't confused. You were just letting it happen. You didn't need to argue. You didn't need to ask for clarity. You already had your answer. Their loyalty was running on fumes, and you could feel it with every interaction. The way they spoke, the way they responded, the way they showed up halfway. All of it told you the truth. But instead of panicking, you stayed still. You watched. You listened. You let them show you exactly who they were becoming. And when it was clear that the loyalty had fully expired, you simply stopped renewing your energy in that direction. You didn't make a scene. You didn't announce your exit. You just adjusted your posture and kept moving. That's what shook them. Not just that you knew, but that you didn't flinch. You didn't beg, question, or explain. You just quietly retracted your access and gave them space to betray you at full volume. That level of peace messes with people who were expecting a reaction. They wanted confusion. They expected a meltdown. But all they got was silence. Not because you didn't care, but because you cared enough about yourself to stop feeding something that was clearly dying. Now they're confused. They're trying to figure out how you knew. They're trying to replay conversations to see if they slipped up. But you weren't listening to what they were saying. You were watching what they were doing. You were tuned into the energy, and the moment their loyalty shifted, you noticed. You didn't need confirmation. You just stepped back and let the connection expire without forcing a renewal that wasn't mutual. That's not detachment, that's discernment. And it's exactly why they're stunned. Number 4. You saw past their words because you heard what their spirit was screaming. They said all the right things. They used the perfect tone, crafted the perfect lines, and smiled at all the right times. But your spirit wasn't listening to their words. It was listening to what was beneath them. While they were busy delivering a performance, your discernment was locked in on the frequency their soul was giving off. And it was loud, desperately loud. Their mouth said, I care. But everything inside them screamed, I'm hiding something. You weren't analyzing grammar, you were watching the delay between their words and their energy. You noticed how their compliments landed with a strange emptiness. You caught how their concern felt rehearsed. You didn't just hear what they said, you felt what they meant. And what they meant didn't match their mouth. They didn't realize that while they were perfecting the outside, your spirit was eavesdropping on the inside. You felt the tension behind their smiles, the hesitation behind their flattery, the calculation behind their kindness. Every I'm here for you came with a vibration that said, only when it's convenient. And you clocked it, every time. They thought they could win you over with polished phrases and predictable sympathy. But you weren't decoding English. You were translating intention. You didn't need them to mess up out loud. You had already heard the inconsistency in the quiet. It was in the energy they couldn't control, no matter how well they managed their facial expressions. That's what's terrifying to them now. Not just that you figured it out, but that you figured it out without a single piece of physical proof. They can't trace your knowing to a message, a mistake, or a rumor. All you had was raw discernment, a spiritual alert system that never sleeps. You weren't reading lips, you were reading spirit. And the message was loud and clear. The scariest part? You didn't argue with them about it. You didn't even ask for clarification. You just mentally logged it, emotionally detached and spiritually disconnected while they kept talking, still thinking they had you convinced. But the truth was, their mouth had never fooled you. Not even once. Number 5. Your calmness wasn't naivety. It was spiritual containment. You weren't quiet because you were in the dark. You were quiet because you were holding too much light. And that light was heavy, full of details, confirmations, revelations, and warnings. You knew exactly what was going on, but you also knew that if you reacted too soon, you'd interrupt a divine process. So you stayed calm. Not because you were unaware, but because you were spiritually disciplined enough to wait. They thought you were slow to catch on, but the truth is you caught everything, every shady glance, every coded conversation, every shift in behavior. You saw it all, but instead of confronting it, you carried it. And that kind of stillness isn't weakness, it's strategy, it's spiritual containment. You weren't suppressing emotions, you were protecting divine timing. You were fully aware that if you exploded, the truth would get tangled in emotion. If you reacted, it would distract from what God was exposing naturally. So you said nothing. You let them move. You let them plot. You let them think they were winning. All the while you were watching the trap take shape around them, not because you set it, but because heaven had already laid it out, and your only job was to stay in position. The real reason your calmness scared them is because it didn't make sense. Most people react when they're hurt. Most people confront when they feel betrayed, but you didn't. And that silence made them paranoid. Your lack of reaction told them something they didn't want to believe. You already knew. Not only did you know, you were letting it all unfold. You weren't stalling. You weren't waiting for more proof. You were holding yourself back, holding your peace, holding your posture, because you knew this wasn't your battle to fight. God was doing the exposing. All you had to do was not interfere. And that level of self-control, that's not softness. That's spiritual warfare on mute. Now that the truth is out, they're confused about how you stayed so composed. They still don't understand that your calm wasn't a lack of awareness. It was a surplus of wisdom. You didn't panic because you already saw the outcome. You were just waiting for heaven to flip the final card. Number 6, you let them dig because you already read the burial plans. They thought they were slick, thought their whispers would never reach you. Thought their strategy to bury your name, your peace, your progress was too calculated for you to notice. But what they didn't know was you had already read the entire burial plan before they ever picked up a shovel. You weren't caught off guard. You saw it coming. And instead of stopping them, you stood back and let them dig. You knew their intentions weren't pure. You saw the envy rising in their tone, the secret competition in their so-called support, the subtle digs masked as jokes. It wasn't one moment that exposed them. It was 100 little signs they thought you missed, but you didn't. You just chose not to respond, because you weren't trying to save them from the grave they were building with their own hands. You were fully aware of the trap. But you also knew something deeper. People who build destruction for others will always end up walking right into it themselves. You didn't need to fight them. You didn't need to warn them. You didn't even need to defend yourself. You let them plan the sabotage because you had already seen the twist. They weren't burying you, they were burying themselves. Emotionally, they tried to wear you down. Spiritually, they tried to disconnect you from your source. Financially, some even hoped you'd collapse or become dependent. But you saw the sabotage while they were still smiling in your face. You just stayed quiet long enough for them to reveal themselves in full. They thought you didn't know. They thought their plans were hidden. But heaven doesn't leave chosen ones uninformed. You weren't reacting because you'd already been given the ending. You were at peace because you knew that what they buried wasn't you. It was their own integrity, their own reputation, their own spiritual covering. Now that everything is backfiring, they don't understand how you stayed so calm. They're shocked you didn't try to stop them. But the truth is you didn't need to. You let them dig the whole thing out, confident that when the dust settled, it wouldn't be your name lying in that hole. It would be the truth they tried to kill. And it resurrected stronger than ever. Number 7. You knew the whole script because you've seen this demon wear different faces. You didn't need time to figure them out. You recognized the energy from the very beginning. The manipulation, the flattery, the subtle guilt-tripping, it all felt too familiar. Not because you were paranoid, but because you faced that same spirit before. It just came in a different outfit this time. A new face, a new voice, maybe even a more charming delivery, but the same dark blueprint underneath. That's why you didn't fall for it. That's why your guard was already up. People around you might have said, give them a chance, or maybe you're overthinking. But deep down, you knew better. You've seen this pattern. You've lived through this setup. And you've survived the consequences of ignoring it in the past. So this time you moved differently. They thought they were being clever. They thought they had you wrapped around their finger with their crafted persona and fake vulnerability. But what they didn't know was you weren't dealing with them. You were dealing with the spirit behind them. And that spirit had already tried you through others. You learned its tactics the hard way. The love bombing, the sudden coldness, the mind games, the sabotage dressed up as concern. None of it was new to you. They thought their manipulation was original. They didn't know they were just the latest actor playing a role in a demonic rerun. You'd already seen the script. That's why you didn't entertain the drama. That's why you didn't take the bait. You weren't confused or caught off guard. You were just watching another performance in a series you've already outgrown. You weren't being judgmental. You were being spiritually responsible. Because you've learned that when you let familiar demons walk back into your life wearing new faces, they don't leave until they take something with them. And this time, you weren't willing to lose your peace, your clarity, or your position. That's why you moved in silence. That's why you responded with wisdom, not emotion. And that's why they're so shocked now, because they thought they had something special over you. They thought they were getting away with it. But all along, you were just waiting for the scene to end, knowing exactly how it would play out. Number 8, you made eye contact with their shadow while they smiled in your face. They really thought their smile was working on you. They leaned into charm, charisma, fake warmth, thinking you were buying every bit of it. But the truth is, you weren't even focused on their words or their expression. You were looking through them, past their tone, past their gestures, straight into the shadow that was operating behind the performance. You saw it before they even said anything off. Your spirit caught the energy the moment they entered the room, and while they were busy playing innocent, you were already clocking the spirit they were hosting, not because you were suspicious, but because your gift doesn't need physical proof to identify spiritual presence. Your eyes weren't just seeing the person, they were reading the room. They thought they had you fooled. They really believed they could manipulate the connection and still stay undetected, but you weren't impressed by their appearance. You weren't swayed by their compliments. You weren't distracted by the version of themselves they wanted you to see. You were engaged with what they didn't want you to notice, the spiritual residue they couldn't hide no matter how good they acted. What makes this level of discernment so powerful is that you don't have to accuse anyone. You don't even have to explain it. You just know. You feel it. You sense it. It shows up in how the atmosphere shifts when they walk in. It shows up in how your spirit gets tense even when their words are soft. It shows up in the contradiction between what they're saying and what your spirit is screaming. And still, you let it play out. You didn't panic. You didn't expose them on the spot. You stayed calm and let the mask slide off naturally. That composure is what unnerves them. Because deep down, they know something's not adding up, but they can't figure out how you already see them for who they are. It's simple. They were watching you with physical eyes, but you were looking at them through the lens of spiritual truth. That's what shocks them now. You made direct eye contact with the darkness they thought was hidden. And while they smiled in your face, thinking they were in control, you were shaking hands with the demon they didn't even know was exposed. Number 9, your detachment wasn't coldness. It was an exit strategy without announcement. They thought you were acting distant because life got busy. They assumed you were being flaky, inconsistent, or just distracted. But you weren't any of those things. You had already left the situation emotionally. You just hadn't walked out physically yet. Once your spirit saw what was really going on behind the scenes, something in you quietly shifted. You stopped showing up with the same heart because you no longer felt safe handing it over. You didn't announce your departure. You didn't send a final message or give a dramatic goodbye. You simply stopped investing where the soil was fake. And you did it without apology because deep down, you knew. They knew what they did. There was no need to explain something they fully understood but hoped you'd overlook. The very moment their loyalty cracked, the connection broke, and instead of fixing it, you walked out with your dignity intact and your mouth shut. They didn't notice the exact moment you disconnected because you didn't make a scene. You still smiled, you still responded. You might have even hung around for a while longer, but your presence wasn't the same. Your soul had already evacuated. You weren't cold, you were finished. What confuses them now is how you managed to leave so quietly, how you didn't explode, how you didn't demand closure or validation. But that's because you've matured. You've grown to a place where you understand that once betrayal has been committed, you owe no one a monologue. You owe yourself peace. And peace doesn't always require a performance, so you backed out gracefully, strategically. With every unanswered message and every delayed response, you were packing your energy up and taking it back. And when you were finally gone, they started to realize what happened, but by then it was too late. Now they're left sitting in confusion, wondering what changed. The truth is everything changed, because the moment you saw what they were hiding, you lost the version of them you could trust. And once that trust is gone, access is revoked, quietly, fully, and permanently. You didn't walk away cold, you walked away clean, and no explanation was necessary. Number 10, you didn't predict the fallout. You watched the dominoes already falling. They're shocked that everything's unraveling just like you said it would. To them, it looks like you had some kind of psychic moment or made a lucky guess. But what they don't understand is you didn't predict anything, you just paid attention. You weren't reacting emotionally, you were observing spiritually. And from the start, you could see the pattern, the cracks, the setup, the inevitable fallout hiding behind all the fake smiles and hidden motives. They thought you were being dramatic or negative when you spoke the truth, but you weren't emotional, you were accurate. You saw the way their choices were stacking up. You saw how ego was driving decisions, how lies were starting to slip, how the double life was getting harder to keep hidden. You weren't speaking doom into existence. You were describing what was already happening behind the scenes. They didn't want to hear it. They brushed off your warnings, maybe even laughed at your concerns. But you weren't trying to win an argument. You were just trying to hold up a mirror. And now that the fallout has finally arrived, they're panicking, not just because things went wrong, but because you already knew they would. You weren't surprised when everything started collapsing. You had already watched the spiritual dominoes start falling one by one. You knew their character wasn't going to hold under pressure. You knew the truth always catches up. You saw them planting seeds that would eventually choke their own harvest. And you quietly took note. They're not just shocked by the outcome, they're haunted by the fact that you described it in detail before it ever happened. And now, watching everything crumble exactly how you said it would, it's messing with them, because it proves you were never operating from assumption. You were operating from alignment, from insight, from clarity. You didn't curse them. You didn't wish anything bad. You simply told the truth and stepped out of the way. And now that the consequences have arrived, they're finally starting to understand that your voice wasn't a threat. It was a warning, one they chose to ignore until it was too late. Number 11. You never reacted because you were already in recovery. They were bracing for the moment you'd finally find out. They expected rage, confrontation, or at the very least a meltdown. But that moment never came, not because you were unaware, but because you had already passed that stage. You didn't react because you had already started healing long before the truth became public. The betrayal didn't shock you. The lies didn't break you. You had already grieved the connection in private, while they were still pretending everything was fine. They were performing like nothing had changed, not realizing you were silently processing the reality they thought they had hidden. While they were laughing, you were detaching. While they were covering their tracks, you were finding closure without answers. You had already felt the weight of the loss, already cried the unspoken tears, already accepted that someone you once cared about had quietly left the relationship long before you did. That's why they never got the reaction they were expecting. They were waiting for you to break down, but you were too far along in your healing to break. You had already been through the worst part, the internal realization that this person could no longer be trusted. By the time the truth surfaced, it wasn't news, it was just confirmation. The part that disturbs them now is how composed you are, how you never threw dirt, how you never tried to expose them, how you never sought revenge. What they don't realize is that your silence wasn't numbness, it was healing. You had already walked through the pain. You didn't need to relive it just to prove a point. They thought they had time. They thought they had control over how things would unfold, but you had already left the emotional building, and that's what hurts the most, knowing that you were gone before they even knew they lost you. Your peace isn't performative. It's earned. You didn't just move on, you worked through it, quietly, privately, authentically. And now that you're whole again, they're stuck wondering why you never exploded. But you didn't need to. You already outgrew the pain they thought would paralyze you. And that's the part they never saw coming. Number 12, you weren't being quiet, you were being strategic with what God showed you. They thought your silence meant you didn't know, that you were in the dark, oblivious to the shade, the lies, the backhanded moves. But your quietness wasn't ignorance, it was strategy. You had already been shown what was going on. God had already revealed the truth to you in ways only you could understand. And instead of reacting, you respected the instruction. Wait. Every time you held back from confronting them, it wasn't because you were weak. It was because you were obedient. You weren't withholding information. You were protecting divine timing. What you knew could have blown everything wide open. But God didn't give you the green light to move, so you waited. Not out of fear, but out of wisdom. And that waiting, it was warfare. You weren't trying to gossip. You weren't trying to ruin reputations. You weren't interested in revenge. You were storing what you knew like sealed evidence, locked away until heaven said it was time. You were being precise, calculated, not out of malice, but because you understood something they didn't. Some exposures are better handled by God than by your emotions. They thought they had time to get ahead of the truth. They thought they could keep playing the role, keep smiling in your face, and you'd never catch on. But the entire time, you were watching them, holding the truth close, letting it ripen. You knew that anything revealed before its appointed time can be dismissed or manipulated, so you let them think you didn't know. You let them move freely, never realizing you were keeping receipts the Spirit gave you directly. Now that everything is starting to unfold, they're in shock. Not just because the truth is out, but because of how it's coming out without your hands on it. They're realizing you weren't silent because you were scared. You were silent because you were led. And that silence was a setup, not for your failure, but for their exposure. You weren't keeping secrets. You were waiting for justice to arrive. And now that it has, they're discovering the most dangerous kind of truth is the one that doesn't need to shout to destroy a lie. Number 13, you recognize the setup because your spirit's been here before. There was nothing new about their performance. The only thing they switched was the face. The setup felt too familiar, the same calculated charm, the fake vulnerability, the eerie calm before the chaos. You didn't even need to investigate it deeply. Your spirit had seen this pattern before, and it immediately flagged the energy. The way they moved, the way they smiled too tightly, the way their words were polished but empty. It was all too rehearsed. You weren't paranoid. You were perceptive. The moment it began, your spirit spoke. That quiet nudge inside didn't ask for proof. It reminded you of how this same kind of energy came dressed in different people in different seasons, but always with the same assignment: derail your growth, distract your purpose, distort your peace. But this time you were too seasoned to fall for it. You didn't panic. You didn't even get angry. You just took a step back and watched it all unfold like déjà vu with a twist. You'd been here before, emotionally, spiritually, energetically. But unlike before, you didn't resist the process. You recognized that even setups can be sacred when you know who's running the bigger script. You weren't looking at the players anymore. You were watching the lesson. And this time, you weren't going to repeat the old mistake of trusting the mask just because it smiled. You let them play their part because you already knew your role. They thought they were setting a trap, but you understood they were actually fulfilling a prophecy. You didn't step in to stop them because they weren't destroying you. They were helping you outgrow another level. You saw their betrayal not as an ending, but as another spiritual checkpoint. You've grown. You're different. And your spirit, your inner GPS, was already navigating you away before the hit even landed. They won't understand how you knew. They'll say you're cold, detached, suspicious. But the truth is, you're just experienced. You don't fight every shadow anymore because you've realized some shadows are just announcements. You're close to something greater. So instead of defending yourself, you let the cycle play out, fully aware that it couldn't harm what it was sent to evolve. Number 14, you didn't need proof. Your spirit had already rendered the verdict. You never needed their confessions. You never waited around hoping the mask would slip. The moment the energy shifted, your spirit picked up what their words tried to hide. They could rehearse their lies with perfect timing and polish their performance until it gleamed, but your intuition didn't need a script to see the truth. While they were counting on your logical mind to demand proof, they underestimated the courtroom inside your soul that had already rendered the verdict. The truth didn't come through eavesdropping or detective work. It came in the stillness. A conviction dropped into your spirit so clear, so sharp that no screenshot could have made it more real. While others wait for evidence to make sense of betrayal, you moved with revelation. That's why you stayed calm. That's why you didn't argue. You already knew the outcome. Their guilt was obvious before their behavior even shifted. And when they tried to gaslight you, you didn't bite. You just stared at them with a quiet knowing that unnerved them more than any confrontation ever could. They thought they had time. They thought you'd be easy to fool. But they didn't realize you're not just emotionally aware. You're spiritually armed. That internal voice, that divine whisper, it's guided you through traps dressed as friendships, relationships, even family ties. So when this latest setup came, you didn't flinch. You didn't ask questions you already had the answers to. You just started detaching. People like you don't argue when something feels off. You listen, not to people, but to God. And God doesn't stutter. That's why you didn't beg, explain, or chase. Your spirit had already closed the case and passed the sentence. Disconnection. They'll never understand how you knew. They'll call you paranoid or accuse you of overreacting. But deep down, they know you saw it. You always do. And what scares them isn't that you figured them out. It's that you didn't even need to try. You were never relying on facts. You were walking in truth. And that's what makes you dangerous in a world addicted to lies. They thought they were playing chess while you were still learning the rules, unaware you'd already mastered the entire board in silence. What blew their minds wasn't just that you knew, it was how early you knew. Before they moved, you had discerned their motive. Before they betrayed you, you had already detached. Before they tried to manipulate you, your spirit had filed the verdict. This wasn't guesswork, this was divine clarity. You weren't eavesdropping, snooping, or decoding hints. You were remembering the energy, remembering the cycle, remembering what God had already shown you in patterns, in silence, in unshakable inner truth. And instead of reacting, you chose to observe. Instead of exploding, you exited, quietly, powerfully, unbothered. They underestimated the weight of your stillness. They mistook your silence for ignorance, not knowing that every moment you stayed quiet, you were watching them self-incriminate, spiritually, energetically, even emotionally. You didn't wait for receipts because your relationship with God has always been your evidence. You moved by revelation, not revenge, and now they're the ones confused, shocked by your precision, haunted by how accurately you saw through them. They can't explain how you knew, and that's what torments them most. But the truth is, when you walk with divine insight, there's no mask thick enough to fool your spirit. So keep that knowing, keep that stillness. You're not just intuitive, you're covered. You're not just observant, you're chosen. And what they failed to realize is that when a chosen one stays quiet, it's never out of weakness. It's because God already spoke. If this message lit something up in your spirit, don't just scroll away, tap into it. Like this video if it resonated with your soul. Comment below and let us know which truth hit the hardest. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded of their divine knowing. Subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another word tailor-made for your spirit. This isn't just content, it's confirmation. So if you're walking in revelation, this is your space. Welcome home.